All right, everyone. So it's just after 12, so I think we'll get started. And if there's any latecomers, then we can just ask them to type in their questions once they arrive. So my name is Kelsey, and I will be leading us through the webinar today. And this should be a short webinar just based on my PhD research, which was conducted at the Ontario Veterinary College. So who are we? So you can't see me, but that's me right there. Um, and I finished my PhD in August. And the next picture is of me with my PhD supervisors, Amy Greer and Terry O'Sullivan. And so we were the main researchers behind this study, and we're very happy to share the results with you today. So why are we doing a webinar? Well, the first is that it's quite accessible to different groups interested in research. So this can be researchers, anyone interested from the government, industry members, and participants. So it's important to note that all of these people might be here on the webinar today, which is really exciting to see and share our results. Second, there's an ability to record the presentation and share it with others. So this presentation is being recorded right now. So if you have some friends that wanted to attend but couldn't, please just contact me and I can send you the recording once it's finished. And third, there's the interactive chat for questions. So if you missed it, there's a chat option right at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. And because I can't hear you, you can type in your questions there. So what I'll be talking about today is some background on the project and the research, and a little bit about the Canadian equine industry and some of the gaps that we wanted to address while conducting this research, and then what we actually did and what we found, and then what we're going to be doing next. So I first wanted to talk a little bit about the history of equine disease outbreaks worldwide. And the first notable example of disease outbreak was in Australia in 2007. At this time, an infected horse was imported into the country and it was not adequately contained in the quarantine facility. And this resulted in the subsequent spread of equine influenza across the country. Equine influenza is a contagious respiratory disease, and before this time, Australia was actually equine influenza free. Once the infected horse was introduced into the country, it led to over 10,000 properties becoming infected. Estimates from the outbreak revealed that over $723 million in direct and indirect financial costs occurred to horse owners, associations, and businesses. And then importantly, these numbers don't count the emotional, the political, or the socioeconomic impacts of the disease. So a few years later, we saw another outbreak similar to the one in Australia, but this time it was in Ogden, Utah in 2011. The National Cunning Horse Association hosted their Western National Championship event in Utah, which is where the star is. Shortly after the event, a horse that was attending the show started to show clinical signs of equine herpes virus infection. So equine herpes virus, or EHV1, can cause respiratory disease in horses and can also cause abortion in mares. And unfortunately, it can cause neurologic disease, which did occur in this scenario. An investigation revealed that 1,600 horses were identified to be at risk for secondary transmission due to being in contact with the 400 horses that had attended the show. The outbreak lasted a few months, and it ended up with 165 cases across 12 states and 2 Canadian provinces, and it led to 13 deaths as well. So how do these large and widespread diseases happen in the first place? At a population level, the movements of horses create an underlying structure that connects individual horses and facilities. These movements can provide opportunities for disease introduction and spread because of the potential for contact between horses while they co-attend at different locations. Another concern is inadequate biosecurity measures, which are used to prevent and limit the spread of diseases. These include biosecurity measures implemented at a facility level, like separation of new horses upon arrival. If these types of biosecurity measures aren't practiced by a facility, or if the practices at a certain facility are unknown, disease introduction spread can occur. Another level of biosecurity is individual level biosecurity, like vaccination at a horse level. The inadequate use of biosecurity measures can become a risk factor for disease introduction spread if horse owners aren't diligent in keeping up with their biosecurity plan. This is especially true if you're coming into contact with other horses or facilities where biosecurity measures aren't sufficiently practiced. So, based on what we have already learned from other disease outbreaks, what do we need to know in Canada? We need to know a description of horse characteristics. So we need to know more about the horse population in Canada and their location and any of their risk factors that might make them more susceptible to developing or coming in contact with the disease. We also need to know about the uses of biosecurity measures. So we don't currently know about what is going on at facilities and what are individual horse owners doing to prevent the introduction and spread of diseases. And third, we need to know about the nature of horse movements. So we don't know about how often horses travel and why they travel. So all of these what do we need to know points formed our study objectives. So I'm just briefly going to talk about the Canadian equine industry. So we currently have the estimates of the 2016 Census of Agriculture, which is conducted by the Canadian government. And the 2016 estimates found that there was 291,000 horses in Canada. Just looking at Ontario, there's over 64,000 horses, which makes up about 22% of the Canadian herd. We also know that the Canadian equine industry is very important to the Canadian economy, and an estimate from 2010 found that it contributed about $19 billion to the Canadian economy per year. So we know about how many horses live in Canada and where, but we want to learn a little bit more about horses in Ontario and how they interact with one another. So we conducted a study, and the participants will recognize this study as being called Equine Study 2015. And this was done in 2 phases. So we started with the recruitment and an enrollment questionnaire. So recruitment and the enrollment questionnaire occurred together, and this was between March and May 2015. And we used a variety of methods for recruitment, in person at different equestrian shows, online, and social media. So using Facebook, Twitter, Kijiji, as well as many blogs, and went through the listserv of many equestrian organizations. So if you were one of the organizations that helped us with recruitment, thank you very much. It was very valuable to us. Once a participant was invited to participate in the study, they filled out an enrollment questionnaire. And this consisted of 14 questions, and it took about 8 minutes to complete on average. And this asked for details on the individual's horse and their home facility, which we defined as the facility where their horse spent the majority of its time. Once an individual was enrolled into our study, then we moved on to the monthly questionnaire. So this was between May and November 2015. And every month we asked individuals who were enrolled into the study to provide detailed information on their monthly travel patterns. So again, if you participate in this study, this probably looks very familiar to you, but this is an example of what the questionnaire actually looked like. So every month, an individual would get this monthly questionnaire in their email, and they would follow the link to complete it. If an individual had a horse who did not travel during the month, they would just simply say, no, my horse did not travel, and their monthly questionnaire entry was finished. If their horse did travel, they would say, yes, my horse left the home facility during this month, and it would bring them to this screen. So here, they had the option to select the dates that their horse left the home facility during a given month. So here you can see that in the example, July 3rd and July 14th was selected. Once these dates were selected, it was carried forward to the second screen of the monthly questionnaire. Here, individuals would provide their details based on whichever dates that they selected. So you can see the dates are listed here at the bottom, and then they could click their reason for travel. So for each movement, they selected a different reason for travel from a drop-down menu. Then they could select the city or type in the city or town where they went, if there is a specific location name for that location that they traveled, and whether or not their horse stayed overnight. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the results of this study. So first we're going to talk about the response rate. So this is just how many people responded to the study. So for the first phase of the project, which was the enrollment questionnaire, this was just getting people to sign up and become enrolled into our other study. 222 owners were enrolled, and they enrolled 570 horses. And now we're going to talk about the results of the monthly questionnaire. So after the enrollment questionnaire, there were some losses before we started the monthly questionnaire. This is mainly due to individuals indicating that they no longer own their horse before the monthly questionnaire started, or individuals not being able to be contacted by us to participate in the monthly questionnaire. So once we consider those losses of those individuals, we were able to count 199 owners and 489 horses. And you can see the graph on the right-hand side shows the percentage of participants that responded in a given month. So you'll see that in May, 90% of those participants responded, which is excellent. And we do get a little bit of a drop during the midway of the study, down to 66% in September, but then we went back up to 75% in November. And these response rates are excellent. They're very good, and we're very proud of the participants who responded to our study. And it's also important to note that 44% of owners completed all questionnaires. So that's the enrollment questionnaire and all 7 monthly questionnaires as well. So if we look at who participated in this study, we broke it down by the primary sport or competition disciplines. So here you can see that the majority of individuals who participated in our study had a competition horse. And these are just examples of the disciplines that were there. It's not all of them. And then you can also see that 33% of the participants were leisure horses and 3% were racing. So it is important to note that racehorses were underrepresented in this study, so we should keep that in mind as we go through the results. So here we asked for the vaccination status of horses that joined the enrollment questionnaire. So on this graph, you have different pathogens on the x-axis. So this is different diseases that your horse might be vaccinated against. And then on the y-axis, you have the proportion. So here is just the percentage of people who indicated that their horse was vaccinated against a certain disease. And you can also see there's different colors on the graph. So the dark gray represents competition horses, the medium gray represents leisure horses, and the light gray represents racing horses. So we can see that the horses in the study had high levels of vaccine coverage, and it did vary depending on whether or not they were competition horses, leisure horses, or racing horses. So I wanted to specifically talk about the vaccine coverage levels for rabies, West Nile virus, and tetanus. So these are the 3 commonly recommended vaccines for horses in Ontario, and it does seem that the proportion of horses that are vaccinated against these three diseases are quite high, which is really great. I also did want to note that even though there was an underrepresentation of racehorses in the study, the ones that were enrolled had lower vaccine coverage for almost all diseases, and there was a higher proportion of owners that were unsure of their vaccination status. So this shows a map of where the home facilities were in the study, and it's overlaid on top of the 2016 Census of Agriculture reported farms with horses. So that Census of Agriculture is the same one that I showed with the map of Canada that had the number of horses in Canada. So here we can look at how representative our study results are compared to the general equine population in Ontario. So the red shows the number of participant farms that we had in our study. And if there's a larger dot, that means that there's more facilities that participated in our study in that area. Darker areas on the underlying map represents more farms reported in that census area. So you can see that there's a really large dot about the south end of Ontario, and that's where the most of our participant farms came from. So moving on to the descriptors of some of the facility characteristics, we asked about how many horses were at a given home facility, and on average, individuals said that there were 17 horses boarded at their facility, but this was really variable. So this ranged between 1 and 105 horses at each facility. And we also wanted to know about the disciplines at facility. So generally, members of the horse industry have thought that horses within the same discipline, like dressage horses, will board at the same home facility, so that if an outbreak were to occur at a dressage show, it could be contained within the dressage community. But in fact, only 24% of participants reported that horses within the same discipline boarded at their home facility, while 76% of participants reported that the horses at their facility participated in multiple disciplines. So, for example, the facility could be mixed with horses that compete in either dressage and horses that compete in hunter-jumper competitions. So these results tell us that horses that participate in different disciplines are actually much more intermixed than we previously thought. So moving on to the horse movements. So this was a really exciting result for us, and we found that in total, there was 3,001 horse movements between May and November 2015. So here we have the total number of movements on the y-axis, and across the bottom we have each month that the study was ongoing. So here we can see that there was many movements in May, and it seemed to decrease a little bit until November, which we had the lowest number of movements. We're also interested in looking at the number of movements per horse. So if a horse traveled at any point during a month, how many times did it actually travel? So again, we can see the average number of trips that a horse took on the y-axis, and at the bottom of the screen we can see the given month that we're talking about. And here we can see a trend. So on average, a horse started out by making about 4 movements in May. Once we went up to August, a horse made around 5 movements on average per month. And then they went back down into November, where they made on average 3 movements per month. And we also wanted to know about why they traveled. So I know this is a little bit small, but I'm just going to try to walk you through it. So here we're looking at the reason for travel, and that's that really long list of text. And each of these boxes is different months. So between May and September, most movements were to attend a competition. And you'll remember that the majority of horses that were in the study were competition horses, so it makes sense that most of the time when they left their home facility, it was to attend a competition. And we do see a switch between the last month, so that's October and November, where most of the movements are no longer to attend a competition, but instead a lot of them are to either attend a lesson, an off-site lesson, or a leisure ride. And so the last part that I'm going to talk about is network analysis. So network analysis is just a technique, and it's a technique that allows us to describe the connections between a group of individuals. And this can be anything. It can be people, it can be places, and it can be horses. So if we just go into this a little bit further, we can describe the connections between horses. And when we do that, it looks something like this. So we have horses as our individual thing of interest. And then we have these lines that represent how these horses are connected. And we can define this relationship in different ways. So it can just be that these two horses came into contact with each other while they're on their farm. So they walked right next to each other. So we draw a line next to them saying that they're connected. It could also be things like they went to a show together. So if you have a horse and your friend has a horse and you bring them to compete at a show, we can draw a line together saying that they were at that show together. We can also talk about connections between facilities. So here is a similar thing, but we'll see that now the facility is the thing of interest. And the connection between facility has turned into an arrow. And this is because most of the time we talk about movements between facilities. So we can define these movements in different ways, and we can represent them visually in different ways. So one of those ways is drawing really thick arrows. So these thick arrows represent many, many, many connections between two different farms. So in one instance, this could represent the movement of multiple horses. So two facilities can be really connected if many horses travel between them. Two facilities can also be really connected if one horse travels between them multiple times. So if you have a single horse and you bring that horse between two locations 30 times in a month, we can also visualize that as a really thick arrow because it means that those two facilities are more connected based on their trading patterns and their movement patterns. So these are some networks that represent the movements of horses between facilities in different months of the study. And if you participated in this study, you should recognize, or at least look at the concept, because you were sent these movement networks every month that you completed the questionnaire. So if we think about the last couple minutes where we've been talking about how we can actually define those connections between individuals, these diagrams show the connections between facilities. So all of the dots are individual home facilities or individual facilities where horses can travel. And all of the arrows between those facilities represent connections. And these are movements of one or more horses. And you'll also see that some of them are thicker than others, and that means that there's many horses moving between those facilities, or there's one horse that moves many, many times between those facilities. And you'll also see that there's certain areas of these diagrams where it's highlighted, and that is just showing the parts of the diagrams where they're all connected. So in the first one in May, that big clump is all connected based on horse movements. So you may not know somebody who traveled from one of those other facilities, but you're all connected because you all went along this pathway to the same facilities that were connected with each other. And one of our interests is looking at how these evolve and how these change over time. So even just by looking at it, you can see that from May to November, May has a lot more facilities and a lot more connections in the diagram compared to November, where there's fewer facilities and fewer connections in that diagram. And we can think about the graph that you were shown where most of the movements occurred in May, and there were a smaller number of movements that occurred in November. So here we want to also look at how the movements of horses in both competition, which is brown, and leisure, which is blue, create connections between facilities in Ontario and how these characteristics of the clumps, so the gray highlighted parts, will change over time. And so I did want to talk about what we'll be doing next. So we want to look at more details on the horse movement network, so those really nice looking diagrams. So we were able to create them based on the owner completed monthly questionnaires from the study, but we want to know more. We want to understand the characteristics of the diagrams. We want to understand the characteristics of how the movement patterns between horses and facilities in Ontario might actually contribute or prevent the disease spread in the province. And of course, there's always additional research projects. So Dr. Amy Greer and Dr. Terry O'Sullivan have a really great program on equine research. So if you're interested in any other additional research that they do, then please feel free to contact them. So I just wanted to acknowledge the funders that helped us, so Equine Guelph, NSERC, the Canada Research Chairs Program, OMAFRA, and my personal funding for my PhD from the Ontario Veterinary College and the Ontario Graduate Scholarship, as well as my PhD Advisory Committee, Dr. Amy Greer, Dr. Terry O'Sullivan, and Dr. Zvonimir Poljak, and of course the research assistants, so Beverly Go, Sydney Bogan, Karen Richardson, and Wayne Johnston. And last but not least, my participants who filled out all of these questionnaires and stayed with me the entire time. So with that, thank you very much for listening. And here, just a reminder that I can't hear you. So if you have a question, please type it into the chat and I will get to it. Okay, so I see a lot of questions. So I'm just going to start from the top. Okay, so the first question is, in the network maps, are locations placed in the same place each month? So I'm going to go back to this slide, and that's a really good question, and the answer is no. So they're not spatially explicit, which means that they're not their position on the map doesn't represent anything in terms of geography. So the reason behind that is I had originally made them so that they were on a map, but because Ontario is so large and the movements, the location of the movements are so small relative to each other, it looks like a big clump. So here they're not spatially explicit, so we can't actually compare between them visually, but we can do that analytically. So each of these dots is linked to a number. So I know that if one of the big dots in May is number 1, and the same big dot occurs every single month, then we can look at the characteristics of facility number 1 and see if there's anything different about that. Okay, so the next question, was there any reason you didn't sample December to May? I'm curious as that is breeding foaling season. Again, excellent question. And there's two reasons behind that. So the first is that we assume that most of the movements would occur between May and November. So here we have a competition season when most horses will be moving between different facilities to attend competitions. So we thought that if we just sample in this time period, then it would tell us about the majority of the movement patterns in this season. The second reason is that it's very logistically infeasible to sample for an entire year. And although we would have loved to, it really is a great deal of burden on an individual horse owner to report their movement patterns for an entire year, especially in the detailed way that we ask them to. So even provide even getting them to answer between May and November was incredible, and I'm very thankful that they did. So I guess we didn't want to overburden them. And does anyone else have any questions? I'm just going to go right back to the last slide. Okay, so if nobody else has any questions, please feel free to email me afterwards if you think of a question. You can also email Amy or Terry, and we'd be happy to. Oh, people are still typing. But I'll just finish that. So we'd be really happy to answer any of your questions. So I'll still wait another couple minutes and we'll see if anyone else has any last questions. But if you need to leave, then please feel free to leave. And thank you again for attending. So we do have one more question. So the question is, I'm just curious if the locations with the most movements in May were the ones with the most movements in June, or did it change? So again, I'm just going to go back to those diagrams. So the answer to that is yes and no. So we still need to explore this a little bit further, but just when I was going through the data, there were some patterns that I noticed. So the first being is that, yes, sometimes. So some of the locations where there's a lot of spiky movements out, and you should be able to see in August, there's a really good one right near the end of the diagram. So some like that are the same facilities. And here it's someone who travels a lot with their horses or they have a lot of horses. And in this case, they're not connected to anyone else, but they go to many, many, many locations. But sometimes the facility in each of these maps is different, and that actually depends on what's occurring that month. So there's one month when there's a very large hunter jumper competition. And since the majority of the horses that we had in our study were competition horses, they actually quite a lot of them actually went to that competition. So you can see this big, big facility in the map and lots of connections going to it. And so this will change. So in different months, there tends to be like a big competition that someone will go to. So in that case, many of the horses will go there. So it is really interesting from a disease prevention and control standpoint because we can look at these facility characteristics and evaluate if there's something specific like that in that instance, and then we could potentially target that for future disease prevention and control measures. Are there any last questions that we have, or are people okay? Okay, so if you have any further questions or if you think of anything, then please feel free to email me. You can also email Amy or Terry if you think of anything else. And I can have the copy of the webinar ready. And if you have any other friends um, that would like to have attended but couldn't, then we can send them the webinar as well. So again, thank you very much everyone for attending. I'd be very happy to talk more about it if you would be interested. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.